Well, I was born in Honolulu. I was born into a family that ran something called the Chun supermarket. So, um, my father and mother both grew up in Honolulu. My father was a businessman. He went to the University of Chicago. And my mother worked at a settlement house initially called Palama Settlement. And later she held various positions in the family business, but she was, by training, a professional secretary. I grew up in Alewa Heights, and actually grew up about a block from Senator Hiram Fong, although I had very little interaction with him. Well, yeah, I have one sister, Camille, who's also a lawyer and who's now employed at the Department of Labor, state of Hawaii. Well, unlike my present sedentary and inactive lifestyle, I was fairly athletic as a child, and I played police activities league baseball. I was not someone who fell in love with the ocean, and some of my friends, when they visit me in Hawaii, ridicule me because I don't surf or do those other things that you're supposed to do in Hawaii. So I'm not sure I could say that I had a typical Hawaiian childhood, but I guess I did all the things that boys do when they grow up, and I went to Punahou High School, where President Obama went.
How was it like at that time at Punahou?
Well, it was predominantly white, but I didn't experience any overt discrimination or things like that. Yeah.
And then your family was pretty prominent in Honolulu, would you say? And
well, I think I think. Yeah, well, I mean, one of my aunts was on the board of Queen's Hospital. One of my uncles was a very well-known orthopedic surgeon who became Physician of the Year in Hawaii and who was very beloved by his patients. My grandfather, came to Hawaii as a very young man in his teens and was, I guess, sort of a typical Horatio Alger story, if there is such a typical story. And he started, I think, as a peddler, but eventually somehow, and I don't know all the details, but he had an exclusive contract to sell produce to the Army. And I guess he managed his money well because eventually he had a store, and that led to ultimately having 2 supermarkets. And when he died, the obituaries described him as the merchant prince because he was also a philanthropic man, and he gave the land for a Buddhist temple in Honolulu called the Kuan Yin Temple.
And was he involved in that temple?
I'm sure he was to some degree, but he passed away before I was born, so I know very little directly about him.
Going to Punahou is known as a college prep academy. Did you go to public school before?
No, I actually went to Punahou for 13 years, and for anyone who wants to understand my life experience, I guess I would say I was somewhat sheltered at Punahou. Although the fact that I played police activities league baseball allowed me to meet a lot of boys from public school, and I always thought that was a very good and important facet of my life, that I wasn't confined to just knowing students at Punahou.
But your education at Punahou got you to Yale. Can you talk about that process of deciding to go to Yale?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was sort of an interesting time in the history of Yale also, because R. Inslee Clark, who was the director of admissions at Yale, who was affectionately known as Inky Clark, for some reason he took the trip to Hawaii that year to interview students. And so he interviewed a number of us who'd started an underground newspaper at Punahou, which we called Dementia Praecox. And for those of you who aren't psychoanalysts or psychologists, dementia praecox is a form of schizophrenia peculiar to adolescents. And I don't really know why we chose that name, but Clark was somewhat taken with the fact that we had created this underground newspaper. And so 3 or 4 of us in my senior class wound up getting admitted to Yale. Of course, when I went to Yale, that was something very different because there were only about 10 of us in a class of 1,000, and at the time, Yale was an all-male school, who were Asian American. And perhaps that is one of the ways in which I became more conscious of a racial identity, and one of the factors that propelled me to eventually work at UCLA. And it was sort of just these little strange things, like I was at the University Health Center getting ultraviolet treatment because my skin was very dry. And so there was an older Caucasian male who was the technician, and he started talking to me in Mandarin. And I had no idea what he was saying. And you know, he was just trying to be nice to me, but it wasn't what I expected. And then, you know, I had to take a step back and realize, well, you know, he was looking at me, expecting me to speak Chinese, and although I had gone to Chinese school for 1 or 2 years, you know, I sort of failed miserably in learning the language.
I think that's partly probably a shock going from Hawaii to Yale, as opposed to having those things happen to you when you were growing up, for those who grew up on the mainland. How was that transition going from Hawaii? Going from Hawaii to the continental context in terms of that whole racial, the different racial context.
Well, perhaps, you know, the one incident that I remember most is because it was an all-male school, the only way you would meet women was you go to these mixers. And so one day in my residential college, there was a mixer with women from Wellesley. So the women literally would be bussed in from Wellesley, Massachusetts, and you know, I had dinner that evening with a Caucasian red-haired woman. And after dinner, she said, "Excuse me, I have to go to the ladies' room." And I waited for her 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and then one of her friends came out and said to me in the gentlest way possible, "You know, I'm sorry, but I don't think she's going to come out." And my reaction was, well, I would admit very freely that I was quite nerdy at the time, and so, you know, if she didn't want to come out and have anything to do with me, you know, I could understand on one level. But the question that I asked myself also was, did it have anything to do with race? And on another occasion that fall, I was sitting in the residential college library because each of the 12 residential colleges that existed then at Yale had libraries where you could study, and there's a small collection of books. And when I was tired of studying, I just happened to reach up on the shelf and grab a book, and it turned out to be a book that had something to do with the history of immigration to the United States. And I learned for the first time that there had been such a thing as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which I had never known. Okay. So from sort of those random experiences and being treated a little bit differently sometimes, you know, I became more aware of myself as ethnically different. And some of course, you know, things were changing in the country at that point in time, and Huey Newton was on trial in New Haven. 50,000 people protested the war in Vietnam. during my junior year of college. And the campus was actually taken over for a weekend by the National Guard because, Newton was on trial. The Black Panther Party was very active in New Haven, and some feared that there would be imminent violence. There wasn't, but it was somewhat surreal to see people my own age who were National Guardsmen, standing on the street corners of the campus with fixed bayonets and these shiny military helmets. And so that left quite an impression also. Well, I think honestly my reaction was probably confusion. I think, I needed to figure out kind of where I fit in as a person. And I think one response to that was, we started an Asian American Students Association, which held one of the first conferences on the East Coast, 300 people in the Yale Law School auditorium. And one of the funny things I remember about that is that one of my friends, who's also a lawyer in Honolulu, excellent labor lawyer named Herbert Takahashi, was a law student at Harvard. He came down to the conference and was wearing a military flak jacket. And at the beginning of the conference, he got up and he said, surprisingly, that he thought all the white people should leave the conference. And there weren't any white people actually in the conference, not by exclusion, it just wasn't. But the funny thing that happened was the two Chicanos got up and left. One was Carlos Moreno, and one was Joaquin Avila. And Carlos Moreno became the United States ambassador to Belize and a federal judge. Joaquin Avila became the president of the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund and an expert on voting rights. I think he also won a MacArthur Scholarship. But I think Carlos and Joaquin, who knew another of my friends who was Don Nakanishi, I think they just felt, well, if the Asians wanted to get their thing together on their own, then they'd just leave us alone. But I just found that very ironic that they became such distinguished people and they left the conference.
Maybe help them understand exclusion. Not that they didn't understand that already. Can you tell me, what year that happened, who organized it, and what it was about substantively?
Well, I think it was the fall of 1970. I'm not absolutely positive. Glenn Umatsu was a graduate student at Yale, I believe that year. Don Nakanishi was instrumental into it. A woman named Alice Young, who became a distinguished international lawyer. Another person from New York, Glenn Lau Key, and Rocky Chen, who was then a graduate student in city planning.
And do you know what the purpose was and what it covered, what issues it addressed?
Well, I actually don't clearly remember. I would imagine it, to some degree, addressed the United States' involvement in Vietnam. I think it addressed issues of urban unrest, and also in a very broad way, it was perhaps part of the beginnings of an attempt to form an Asian American identity. One thing that later came out of that is we had our first Asian American Studies class at Yale, taught by a political scientist named Chitoshi Yanagi. And well, and again, that was a further attempt to explore and define, what our role as individuals and as a group should be in American society.
Did you take that class?
Yes, yeah.
So can you describe kind of your own growth and transformation through all of those experiences and exposures during your time at Yale?
Well, I think what happened that's directly pertinent to the continuation of the center was one of the ideas that came out of the class was that we might want to start a journal of some kind. And so we created the Amerasia Journal. Some of the things that were involved in that is, of course, we needed money. Since my family was in business, I actually raised $2,000 by primarily talking to business associates of my family, and people would chip in $100 here or there. And the $2,000 was the seed capital to publish the first journal. Billy Chen, who's an architect who's designing the Obama Presidential Library, was one of my classmates. She did the cover design for the first issue of the journal. Bill Land Lee, who was at one time nominated to be the Deputy Attorney General in charge of civil rights for the Clinton administration, wrote a piece on the first Chinese graduate from Yale, the first Asian graduate from Yale, Yung Wing, who I believe graduated in 1854. Rocky Chin wrote an article about New York's Chinatown from a city planning perspective. I wrote an article on a book by autobiography by Jade Snow Wong, and I think it was called Jade Snow Wong and the Fate of Chinese American Identity, where I tried to extrapolate from her life experience certain cultural factors that I thought were in common with Chinese American identity.
And 45 issues later.
Right. Yeah.
Did you think it would become as significant of a journal as?
No, I had no idea, but I was fortunate to get a job from UCLA. I think Don Nakanishi had talked to Alan Nishio, who was then well, I forget exactly what Alan's title was, but he was, the administrative coordinator of the center. I think probably Harry Kitano was officially the faculty head of the center at that time. And I was offered a half-time job to come out to UCLA to continue the journal. And I think it, was the ability to forge that relationship with UCLA that allowed the journal to continue and thrive.
Can you tell me a little bit about, so you graduated from Yale, can you tell me a little bit about what you ended up majoring in and what you thought you might do in the future at that time, and then your decision to come to UCLA?
Well, I think at that time, I applied to law school, but I guess one thing that my earlier experiences in education made me very aware of was I actually felt I was extremely naive. I felt I had very little real experience with sort of the tangible day-to-day lives of people. I felt I was sheltered and overprotected. And so in some way, I just said to myself, you need to get out of this cocoon and try to do something that's more real. So the opportunity to work at UCLA was an opportunity to sort of try to grow in those ways. And As it happened, my uncle, William Chun, was the principal of Castelar Elementary School. And so I tried to teach English as a second language to small groups of kids 3 days a week for a couple of years in something called the Daijung School. And this was created by two of my other friends who also worked at the center, Phyllis Chu and Buck Wong. And I did some things that were sort of ridiculous and funny. There was a newspaper that was published in Chinatown at that time called Chinese Awareness, which was a bilingual newspaper. And I didn't speak Chinese, but I had the audacity to try to go back into some of the Chinese restaurants and sell this newspaper to restaurant workers who I'm sure, you know, were sort of mildly offended that this kid who didn't speak Chinese would try to sell them this literature.
Did you work on Chinese awareness?
No, but I did try to sell it at least one or two times, and you know, another incident that's perhaps an indication of the times is the center had a curriculum coordinator at that time who had done graduate studies at the University of Michigan, Alan Moriyama, and Alan was from Hawaii also. The first night Alan came to LA, or one of his first nights in LA, we went to Chinatown together, but we were briefly detained by the Los Angeles police because there was a problem with, you know, youth gangs that were perceived to be violent. And so we briefly got swept up in.
That's what you came to
Yeah.
LA for. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Right. And then, you know, the other thing that just popped into my mind is, you know, that there was this Chinese young man who didn't quite fit in, who just struck us all as a little bit odd, but he hung around the Chinatown teen posts where there was some attempt to help immigrant youth. And in later years, I learned that this person was actually a covert agent of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, and that the teen post had been under surveillance. And
So these issues of civil liberties, they start to kind of impact how youth looked at the world at all, or were they just kind of passing, you know, memories, or just kind of incidental things that happened?
well, I'm not so sure that I would characterize my thought process as civil liberties, but I think there was at this time just the notion that you should go back to your community of origin and make some kind of a contribution. In terms of what I had to offer, which was limited, you know, teaching English as a second language was perhaps a useful skill to at least help the education of some of these students in an elementary school. You know, there were. It may sound a little fanciful or even ostentatious in a way, but I think, you know, that there was a much broader attempt by things like Students for a Democratic Society to transform and reshape the whole country. And so in a limited way, I think the people that I hung around with, including people at the center, thought that they were some part of this process. Childcare was getting started for working women in Chinatown. I wasn't a part of that effort, but I know a woman named Yvonne Nishio, another woman named Chen, who also worked at the center, did some really excellent work in that area.
Going back to Amarisia Journal, so you moved at the center to continue Amerasia Journal. Can you tell me a little bit more about what that experience was like and how it kind of evolved in this move from Yale to UCLA?
Well, I think, I had a half-time position. Looking back at it, I was not at all a professional journalist, and I think some of the typographical errors that appear in some of the early issues are frankly shameful, and I accept exclusive responsibility for that mistake. But I think what was exciting and positive about it was, it was an opportunity to create something entirely new, to be part of sort of forging this collective consciousness, if one will. And it was a chance to receive ideas from people all around the country, though perhaps predominantly from California. Psychological studies of Asian American identity by people like the Sioux brothers or a man named Ben Tong. Work on Issei Socialists by Yuji Ichioka, who was also very much a part of the center. But I think in contrast to sort of the broad network of scholars that probably exists today, in the beginning it was, to some extent, Don and my personal contacts, although, it soon grew beyond that through the efforts of many other people, like subsequent editors like Carolyn Yee and Dick Osumi. But I think, the real lasting contribution of the journal probably was primarily shaped by somebody like Russell Leong, who worked there, at a much higher level for many years.
What was your motivation to work on the journal?
Well, again, this sounds extraordinarily pretentious, but in English literature class, we studied the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot. And Eliot wrote the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock when he was a sophomore at Harvard at age 19. And so I had this very odd mental process. If Eliot could write this lasting contribution to literature when he was 19, why couldn't we at least start some kind of a journal for Asian Americans? But, the interesting thing is, Don and I actually did it, and I remember sitting in his dorm room, and neither he nor I had a very active social life at that point in our lives, or perhaps the journal never would have happened. But we just had this idea, and we tried to run with it.
Can you tell me a little bit more about Don and the kind of person he was and the role that he played?
Yeah. Well, Don was a remarkable person. I think his father was a produce clerk at a market in Los Angeles. His mother was a seamstress. He was the boy mayor of LA in 1967, I believe. When he got to Yale, one of the most striking things that happened to him, and this is actually true, on December 7th, 1967, other students in his dorm room got water balloons and attacked his room in commemoration of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And I don't think it was intended to be vicious. I think it was just a bunch of kids doing what kids do. But looking back on it, it's just remarkable that they would have chosen to act out in that fashion, okay? And when Don originally came to Yale, he wanted to be a pre-med, and he intended to become a doctor, but as time went on, he decided to major in political science. But I think, the whole evolution of Asian American student movements had a lot to do with Glenn Uemoto and Don. And I think Glenn knew a woman named Mary Kochiyama in New York City, and somehow this just all came together.
And just the last piece on Yale. In your experience on the East Coast, coming from Hawaii, coming into the midst of the anti-war movement, civil rights movement, how would you say that impacted your future life trajectory?
Well, I think it sort of set in motion a quest for, what I could try to do that was relevant and meaningful. And I think being at Yale raised all these questions. I think when I went to UCLA, I started to find some answers. And eventually I became, a union side labor lawyer.
Can you talk about the link between your time at UCLA and the center, and any other observations about the center during that time that helps explain your move from doing the Amerasia Journal work to deciding to go to law school, pursuing labor law?
Yeah. Well, I think at some point, although I found the work at the center to be very satisfying, I wanted to do something that was a little bit less abstract than being a scholar. And I was in a graduate program in American history at UCLA. But somehow I had the notion that being a lawyer might have a more direct impact on people's lives, although, I wouldn't completely subscribe to that notion, because certainly scholarship has very profound and far-reaching effects. But it was a period of time when people were involved in political study groups. I was involved in such a group. There was the notion that somehow one should sort of try to proletarianize themselves. I mean, it might sound faintly ridiculous today for me to be discussing that, but it was a genuine impulse. And some people actually went to work, in factories as part of this whole notion that one needed to mobilize the working classes and organize them. But I just didn't see myself doing that, and this may sound homey and traditional, but I also wanted to please my parents. So if I could get a law degree, it would make my parents happy. And yet, at the same time, hopefully, I could do something that I thought was useful and meaningful.
So, how long were you, can you talk about how long you were at UCLA, and then, I could read it, but just to explain it, and then when you decided to apply to law school and where you ended up going?
Well, I was at UCLA from 1971 to 1974, and then I went on to law school at Berkeley.
Yeah, so can you tell me about the kind of discussions that were going on about the center? Because the center was an organized research unit, it wasn't an academic department. So can you talk about how that idea of starting an academic program came up, and why an MA program?
My recollection isn't too strong, but if I had to guess, I think it was probably Lucy Chung Hirata's idea. And Lucy generally had this phrase, walking on two legs. one leg in the community and one leg in the academy. And part of what she tried to do was to unite those two strains. And so I think it was Don, myself, Lucy, with help from Professor Alex Saxton in the history department, who drafted the proposal for the Master of Arts degree in Asian American Studies. I think the sense was that, we were trying to encourage research and scholarship and teaching in, this new area. And so to further the development of specialists, it would be desirable to have a graduate program. And so a proposal was written to the UCLA Faculty Senate, which was approved. And of course, the program still exists today, and
it has graduated several hundred
right.
students.
Me included.
Were there any challenges in establishing the program? Was it a pretty smooth?
My recollection is that it was smooth, that there wasn't significant opposition, and I don't recall a period of difficulty or struggle achieving the program, and it all happened rather rapidly. Yeah.
Do you remember what year?
I think it would have been about 1974. Yeah.
And then you were also on the social studies task force. Can you tell me a little bit about what that task force is, how you got on it, and what you did, or what it did?
Well, that was an interesting experience. I think Franklin Otto and I were appointed by the superintendent of public education, Wilson Riles, to review social studies textbooks in grades 5 through 8 with other ethnic scholars. And just the meetings of the group itself were very interesting. There was a woman who was a black librarian in the at a urban high school in Los Angeles. There was an anthropologist who was a Native American from UC Davis. There was a Chicano scholar from UC Riverside. And I think there was, I'm not absolutely positive about this. I mean, I might be getting a little confused, but I think there was also a black professor from the University of Washington, James A. Banks, who was part of the task force. And we issued a report that was critical of the ethnic content of the social studies books that were used in the California public schools. But it was an interesting educational experience for those of us on the task force, because we got to hear from the perspective of all these different scholars what their concerns were. And that was, just a very positive learning experience.
And what were the main tenor of what was the main tenor of concerns?
Well, that some of the content was inaccurate or degrading, and I really don't remember the specifics after all these years, but I know there were specific passages from the books that different people found offensive, and we cataloged all of those insults or inaccuracies and submitted a report, which I think resulted in the books being changed to some degree, although I really didn't systematically follow up on what changes were made. Well, I think the reason why I went to law school at Berkeley was to a large degree a matter of economics. I kind of look at this as the golden age of education, public education in California, because I think my tuition was $750 a semester. And then, because I'd lived in California for a couple of years, I was a California resident. I guess I had some fanciful notions about how exciting it would be at Berkeley, but law school is sort of law school wherever you go, and so a lot of the first couple of years was just spending a lot of time with the books and trying to survive. I did get involved slightly with the International Hotel Legal Defense Fund. I spent my third year in Los Angeles because the first semester I externed for Judge Robert Takasugi, and I spent a little time with something called the Little Tokyo Legal Task Force or something of that nature. And I really didn't do any significant legal work at all, but I remember that time fondly because we work with Hispanic tenants, and the Hispanic tenants referred to me as Muchacho Abrigado because I had a very boyish face. And
What kind of work did you do with them?
well, I think it was broadly, and I really did not do any work at all. I mean, I just went to meetings, but I think that task force at that time was concerned with the fate of low-income tenants in the Little Tokyo area, and what was going to happen to them. Was adequate housing going to be provided? Were they just going to be expelled from the area, and if so, where would they go? But my participation was very superficial, and
Do you know the name of this task force?
I'm sorry, I actually can't remember at this point. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you decided to go to Berkeley to law school, did you know at that time you wanted to do labor law, or did that come later?
Well, I think I had some idea that I wanted to do that, and
To do, you want to, okay, let's
yeah.
start again.
Yeah. Well, I think I had some general idea when I went to Berkeley that I wanted to do labor law. Probably that was formed by looking at some of the other people that I knew who were already lawyers and practicing in that area.
And was there anything memorable, else memorable that you want to mention about law school and the law school experience?
Well, in terms of activism, I suppose one of the things we did, meaning the Asian American Law Students Association at Berkeley, is we published a report that was highly critical of the use of the LSAT, because we had read some of the academic literature, and actually it was more one of my classmates, Alan Yee. There were studies that showed that, at least with the SAT, that there was a direct correlation between family wealth and scores, and so that the richer you were, generally you had a higher score, and of course wealth correlates with educational opportunities. But we tried to make economic or social disadvantage more of a criteria in the admissions process. We actually testified in the California legislature, and we, I believe the faculty was attempting to eliminate Japanese and Chinese from special admissions while we were there. And we had one memorable press conference where Tricia Toyota, who was then with ABC News, came from Los Angeles to interview our dean, and we understood that that created quite some consternation with the dean that somebody from ABC News was interviewing him about what he was doing with his special admissions program. But I think that was also about the time the U.S. Supreme Court was deciding the Bakke case, and so the whole issue of what the proper scope of special admissions was very prominent. Well, I came back in Honolulu, to Honolulu, and I practiced law with a group of lawyers who were known as Bazelog and Simons. And Bazelog and Simons were founding members of the National Lawyers Guild. They had been recruited to come to Hawaii to represent the ILWU when no lawyers in Hawaii would represent them because of McCarthyism and red baiting. By the time I got to Bazelog and Simons, all the red baiting and McCarthyism stuff was long over. But Harriet Bazelog, who was one of the founding partners, actually had her license taken away because she said that a communist couldn't get a fair trial in Hawaii in a public speech. And so her license was revoked by the Bar Association, and she had to appeal her case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court to have her license reinstated.
Did you work on that case?
Oh, no, that was long before that I think was in 1956 or something like that. But the Bazelog and Simons probably came to Hawaii sometime either in the late 40s or early 50s.
And why did you choose to work with them?
Well, they were perhaps the leading labor law firm on the union side in Hawaii at that time. They had a rich history of being involved in civil liberties kinds of cases, and I was attracted to that. My friend Herbert Takahashi was working there, and he was doing a lot of work with various communities in Hawaii. And when I came back, one of the things that I did was I represented a tenants group called People Against Chinatown Evictions with another lawyer named Wei-Sun Chow, who just graduated from USC Law School. And so there was an attempt to evict both small businesses and low-income tenants from the Chinatown area without giving them adequate relocation assistance. And so Wei-Sun and I each argued one case in the Hawaii Supreme Court. Wei-Sun did the one for tenants, Lau versus Bautista. I did the one for small businesses, City versus Toyama. And we got lower court decisions reversed so that the tenants would get their proper relocation assistance.
I mean, those were important cases to win.
Well, I'm not sure anybody thinks about those cases anymore, but they certainly were important to the tenants who were involved. Yeah. And you know, there was a community organization dedicated to the welfare of the tenants.
What was that?
Well, it's called People Against Chinatown
okay.
Evictions.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you have reflection, the difference that it's made.
Well, I think one thing that I've done that I think matters to some degree is, you know, I've represented 3 different unions: ILW Local 142, the Hawaii Government Employees Association, and the United Public Workers. And so, you know, I think it has been important to these unions to have stable counsel over an extended period of time. And, you know, basically what I would do is either represent the unions in grievance arbitration. Somebody gets fired or there's a dispute over what a contract means. You know, this is a way of resolving these disputes without having a strike. And so much of my work has involved that kind of work. I also do a very large amount of workers' compensation cases, and for reasons that aren't entirely clear to me, I seem to have wound up with a subspecialty in psychological injuries. And so I've represented all kinds of people who've been psychologically traumatized in the workplace. One subset of those people is special education teachers. I mean, I never realized how stressful being a special education teacher was. But I've had 5, roughly, clients who are special education teachers. Virtually all of them really outstanding, idealistic people who somehow became broken to a degree over the course of their work. But if you ask me in terms of contributions, I mean, it's very hard. I thought about this. I can't really point to one particular case, but there was something that happened to me recently that brought home, in a unexpected way, why the work that a lawyer does is sometimes very important. I was just cleaning my house, and I found this gift card with a note from one of my clients that I had not opened for maybe 5 or 10 years. But I opened the card, and a woman said in the card, "Thank you for giving me back my self-esteem and dignity." And this was not a notorious case. This was just somebody who was disabled, who needed money to, support herself. But I just thought to myself, wow, if you restore somebody's self-esteem and dignity, that's pretty great.
Is there anything you regret as an attorney?
Yes, but it's more about the business side of law. And my wife will bear witness to this. I'm a very bad businessman. And one thing that I have learned that I think is important is that you have to pay attention to the business side of law. So I've always wished that I could pay the people that work for me better, but I continue to be a bad businessman, and so it's never happened. But more seriously, I think, the viability of a legal office also depends on its financial stability and your ability to attract people who can just have a decent life, try to buy a home, depends on its financial success. And that's something that I've never really figured out that well. Fortunately, because I came from the family that I did, I don't think it had a major negative impact on the quality of my life, but that is a regret of mine.
Well, I'm sure you have a lot of heart. So, heart and income don't always go together. But that's why you get the letters that you do. In terms of your community involvement, I don't know where to start because there's so many different activities that you've been involved in, so many causes you've helped with. What would you say have been the most meaningful or impactful?
Well, I think in terms of what's been the most impactful and meaningful, I could sort of point to 3 projects that I've worked on, and some of them for a rather long time. But I was involved with starting a public interest law firm, which originally was called Naloyo no Nakanaka, which means Lawyers for the People of Hawaii. And the founder was a lawyer named Bill Hoshijo, who's now the executive director of the Hawaii Civil Rights Commission. But for 10 years or so, Bill did nothing but create this organization. And he started very, very modestly. His dad, who was an accountant, did the books. He got very, very little income. He had to decide some months whether he was going to pay his malpractice insurance or pay himself a salary. But he built an organization that survived. And today, what was originally Naloyo became what's called the Hawaii Immigrant Justice Center. And it's now an immigration law program that's part of the Legal Aid Society of Hawaii. And this is a program that has helped many, many immigrants and other people, asylum seekers, people being deported, women who are victims of domestic violence, who are not citizens, who would be deported if they were not given legal representation and a path towards citizenship. So that's one program that I was involved in that continues to exist today. More recently, I'm involved with a program called the Legal Clinic, which is a part of a broader organization called Justice for Our Neighbors. This is a program of the Methodist Church, and there's approximately 19 or 20 centers throughout the United States that provide assistance to immigrants. Some of the people are involved in, helping people in detention centers and every conceivable kind of immigration problem that there is. But because the legal aid charter nationally prohibits representing undocumented immigrants except in certain limited situations, some of us felt that it was important to have a clinic that would be more devoted towards serving the needs of undocumented workers. And so we're in the process of hiring a staff and opening an office at a Methodist church in Hawaii. And then perhaps the last program that I would refer to is one that I've worked on for 10 years. It's called the Pacific Survivor Center. And it's an organization that provides medical care to victims of human trafficking or other human rights abuses. And one of the things that we've done is also to try to have a robust educational program. And so an animator named Laura Margulies created an animation that's about 12 minutes long that warns teenage girls about the dangers of human trafficking. And it's all based on local experiences. We protect everybody's identity, but some women who are actually trafficked speak off camera about their direct experiences being recruited by pimps and things of that nature. And we have a grant to show that in approximately 40 or 50 schools in Kalihi with a medical program known as Kokua Kalihi Valley. We're also trying to create what's called a human rights provider network. We're trying to create an alliance of physicians, psychologists, physical therapists, anybody who's a medical provider who will be willing to care for the needs of this particular population. And so we have another grant and a person who's literally creating this network.
I think we're into battery range.
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know if we have, maybe just some of those.
Cut it.
Yeah, maybe you could talk about that, how after, what the impact, since you're on that train of thought, what do you feel like the impact of the center was on your life and who you are and who you came to be?
Yeah. I think I can fairly say that I'm a different person because I worked at the UCLA Asian American Studies Center. And perhaps the thing I appreciate the most about it is just the people that I met. And in ways that I don't fully comprehend, I think they had a lasting impact on how I looked at the world. But I found and met a group of people who had a larger vision of purpose and who conducted their lives in a way that was concerned about others in tangible ways, not just in rhetorical ways. And I think that's something that deeply affected me. Perhaps another important part of that is I got to see concretely how people working together could actually affect a change. And I think that's a very powerful lesson for any democratic society, especially today. You know, democracy doesn't happen by accident. It requires a set of skills. And I think, in a way, the center does an excellent job of imparting those skills, which are both analytical and participatory. And although, you know, I never really put it together this way until this very moment, a vital part of the center's educational experience is sort of teaching you to be a good citizen in a democracy.
How is that?
Well, I think, you know, you learn to be analytical on one level, which you know, any university class theoretically teaches you. But I think the kinds of interactions you have with people teach you how to work with one another in meaningful ways. I perhaps couldn't directly attribute this to the center, but I certainly could indirectly because of the people that I met in some of these study sessions that I participated in. In the early 70s, there was a rise of, you know, the women's movement. And I certainly was criticized by women in those groups for certain chauvinist and sexist tendencies, which I think had a positive impact on how I try to treat women throughout my life. But it was an opportunity to receive criticism in a constructive way and to try to learn to modify your behavior. And indirectly, that's the result of the people that I met at UCLA, like Chen or Karen Ito-chan or Amy Uemoto. And I don't know, this is probably just a coincidence, but this work that I do now with the Pacific Survivor Center, I'm the only guy in the organization. But perhaps had I not had the background that I did many years ago in Los Angeles, I would not be able to function in that capacity today.
Well, Mary and them would be very happy to hear what you just said. Thank you. I guess kind of the closer question that we ask people, and you kind of touched on this, but I'll ask it to be consistent with the other interviews is, can you identify, maybe in addition to what you just shared, any particular people, issues, events, or aha moments that have made you who you are today?
Well, I really can't point to any one specific experience, but I do believe that being at the study center when I was there made me a more sensitive person, hopefully a person more responsive to the needs of others, and perhaps also a person who is just more hopeful overall because of what I saw people could accomplish working together.